Welcome to Catholic in America. What the heck was up with the opening ceremony of the Olympics? Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Catholic in America. Well, guys, how about the Olympics? I mean, America's awesome, right?
Good man.
USA. I think we are Catholic in America, so we are proudly representing by far the most medals won by any country in the world, which is the United States of America. We tied the gold medal total with China, though, so that's a little unfortunate. But you know,
but we blew it out in the others.
The other ones,
and then everything. Yeah. I thought it was fantastic. Good Olympics for America. We win it all. We sweep it all.
And that's all that happened. There was nothing else. There was only athletic events that happened during the Olympics. So
I didn't see anything else. So you mentioned the controversy there in the opening. I mean, what was the controversy over the opening ceremonies in the Olympics?
Well, we're a couple weeks behind on this one, but basically, obviously, we had the opening ceremony, which generally speaking, across the board, was great. It was multicultural.
Lots of color.
Lots of rings. And then we got to what seemed to be a overt mockery of the Last Supper, where you had basically, as some persons put it, a gay pride reenactment of the Last Supper, where you had a bunch of persons from the LGBTQ community who looked like that they were doing this Last Supper rendition. So obviously it upset a lot of people, a lot of even bishops of the United States. I know that Bishop Barron spoke out. Lots of Christians. I was actually really surprised by the amount of actually non-Christian support. Many Muslim leaders spoke out against it. Many Jewish leaders spoke out against it, which I thought was actually, interestingly, one of the greatest truly inclusive moments, as you have world religions that don't always get together and don't always agree on most things, and oftentimes are in hostility. But Jews, Muslims, Christians were horrified at this seeming, I say it first, mockery of the Last Supper, where basically you had looked like outright,
Even the Vatican. A couple of days later, I think it was like 7 or 8 days later, even come out and spoke on it as well. So it was a lot of people come out.
Not surprising that this event happened. By the way, the opening ceremonies and the closing ceremonies too. We're not even going to talk about that.
Right.
I was out to dinner watching that happen, and I was like, "What the heck is going on here?" It was muted, and I'm glad it was muted, but I was still confused. But it's basically people with theater degrees. And that are just given carte blanche. Here's $50 million.
Art history backgrounds.
Art history, something to do whatever you want, and you get what you pay for. So I don't know. I was not surprised by it, but obviously the apparent mockery of one of the most central and essential aspects of our faith, which is interesting too. And Bishop Barron did make this point that here in the United States, again, who dominated the Olympics on every stage and every level, which is incredible.
That's good to be able to say.
We just had our Eucharistic Congress here in the United States of America, and where the Eucharist was at the very front and center of thousands of people worshiping, adoring. So just the jarring, kind of displacement of that as you see, this kind of mockery on the world stage.
Huge disconnect.
Yeah.
So you've already kind of hinted at it. So was the Last Supper actually being mocked? That's the question.
Depends on who you ask. I mean, so I think as they've kind of walked it back and sort of the no apologies that have come from the, that's where you give a non-apology, right? From the Olympic Committee. We're sorry if some people were offended by this.
Actually, I referenced that the other day to someone who I said, that an apology I recently gotten was as sincere as the Olympic apology.
Yes, which is not very sincere. So, but to say that this was a Dutch painting, and you referenced it.
From 1635, somewhere 1635, 1640, there was a Dutch, I can't pronounce his name, Jan Brezer.
Mr. Jan.
Yeah, Mr. Jan.
Yeah.
Painted a painting which is called, I believe, The Feast of the Gods, where you have Bacchus right there in the center, or Dionysus, depending on whether Roman or Greek. And there you have this painting where you have him at the center and you have all the gods in the background. You have very clearly at the center of it, you have Apollo, at this in this painting, and Apollo has a traditional halo over his head, right? Because he's the god of poetry and of various different forms of the arts. And so in this, and so that's where you'll have that obviously the person said, well, no, that this was this reenactment of what you thought was the Last Supper was actually, no, this painting of Jan.
A little gaslighting.
From 1635. What was not said was that painting was based upon the Last Supper.
Right.
Right, which was clearly based upon Da Vinci's Last Supper. Also, that the way in which it seems that the the actors who were recreating this scene at the Olympic opening ceremonies were not actually directly in the same way of Jan. It looked like they were more actually shifted in to put into place, or blocking was basically based upon Da Vinci's Last Supper and not upon the actual painting. So,
and the creative people in charge of it were referring to it as La Seine, the supper. It's basically, and the title of it, as for the broadcast and everything else, was the supper, the scene of the supper on the Seine, basically, which is a play on words in French, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to pronounce French. So, like, whatever was said afterwards is try to, like, an apology of, like, oh, those Christians, were overreacting, sort of thing. Obviously Bacchus was there too, so it was kind of a both and. It's obviously an interplay of those things. But any person who saw it, could see that this is at least had strong corollaries to the Last Supper, and then to be overtly sexual. It wasn't just that. It wasn't just that there was people playing roles that we don't disagree with their lifestyle. The actual actions that are being undertaken in that are specifically linked to sexual preferences. There was a child in the midst of it as well, which that to me is something that is very, very disturbing on a lot of levels.
Somebody should have seen that. And
that to me is more controversial. Jesus can take it. You know what I'm saying? Like Jesus can take it, and the church can take it. Christians can take it. But when it's something that it's putting a child in the midst of that, of some sort of performance art piece, that to me is where it gets. That's where the scandal really lies.
Yeah, but I would also say that, jumping off what you say, Jesus can take it. Yes, obviously God can take it. Yeah. Jesus can take it. Jesus is quite familiar with being mocked.
Yes.
Right? So you go back even to the actual day after the Last Supper, and the evening of the Last Supper, where Jesus actually was roundly mocked by the Sanhedrin, was roundly mocked the following day by the Roman soldiers as they put him into a cloak and they put a crown of thorns on his head. So, like, Jesus, there's a long-standing tradition of Jesus being roundly mocked by those who disagree. So to me, I mean, the irony of it was quite enlightening.
Yeah. So will we say that that this actually being mocked there? Then our answer is yes to that question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, I think that it's also, like, if you look at it from art history, which as well as from an artistic expression. And this is where, like, people were like, well, it was either this painting, it was either Da Vinci's painting or it was Jan's painting. Like, which one was it? It's very common in art, and I know this because I've studied art. I was a tour guide for the Vatican, as well as my sister did art, has a background in art. And so, like, it's very common in art that you combine multiple things at the same time. It's not usually an either or.
Right.
Usually your influences are that you can be influenced by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different things. And that's where, as you create your new art piece today, you're oftentimes influenced by a wide variety of things. And that's why you kind of pick and choose what you do and what you kind of build your modern art on. So I think that this idea that people sometimes have been putting forward, well, it was either Da Vinci or it was Jan.
Right.
Like, and if you look at actually opening ceremonies across the board, they did multiple pieces where they had multiple things where you had about 6 or 7 influences of a particular expression. So, for instance, like, to me, I thought it was very clear that the rider on the horse, right, as you had you had a
Pale rider.
The pale rider who was on a metallic horse, seemed to me to be very clear, and that's why everyone was like, is that Joan of Arc? Yeah. And then they're like, well, no, it's the river goddess Sign. Well, no, it's both and.
Yeah.
Like, it's both and. It's a reference to Joan of Arc. It's a reference to the goddess Sign. Right. It's also, I thought it was interesting because it was almost like this return to paganism, which seemed to be actually a major motif of the entire Olympic Games, is that you have multiple cultures from the historical narrative of France's history, where now that we're progressing and that we're moving through the Christian phase, and now we're entering into the neo-pagan age.
Right. Sure. Cutting off Marie Antoinette's head, getting through the revolution. It's interesting too, because I would liken it to, if someone were to have, like, an image of a bearded man coming down a mountain holding tablets, and then have him do something provocative and be like, like, oh, you're making fun of Moses, is the foundational person for Judaism. But like, oh, no, we're not making fun of Moses. We're actually referencing Mel Brooks in the History of the World Part 1. It's kind of like, well, the History of the World Part 1 only exists, that scene exists as a reference to Moses, as a reference to Charlton Heston, so in a sense to kind of like almost be like, no, I don't care about that whole sacred aspect of it. There's this other connection I want to make. So in a sense, I think that as far as art history goes, the Feast of the Gods is basically trying to move forward that repaganization of France and of Europe, and this I think is just kind of a continuation of that. So and all you have left, and it's fascinating. Jonathan Peugeot has got some great insights on this. Is it leaves you with this empty bacchanalian feast instead of the self-giving feast of the Eucharist, and so we've traded the gift of love, which is God Himself, to the God who basically takes everything from us, which is what the pagans gods do, and just get as much as they want and then leave, and then we're left empty and grasping too. So it is a fascinating kind of cultural insight that was on display there, whether they intended it or not.
Yeah. So when is artistic expression offensive?
Whenever I'm offended.
That's fair.
Otherwise, it's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is important for us to be able to say, there's something about art that does push boundaries and does, particularly when it has comedic aspects as well. And I think a lot of times when there's a mean-spiritedness behind it, or it's a not like Christians believe this and Christians are funny people, which I think is true and hilarious. And there's been different things that I've seen. We've done some reviews of stuff as well. Like, that's pretty funny. But it's basically like
Deadpool and Wolverine was pretty funny.
I haven't seen it, but it probably has a lot of that. But
might be a little morally offensive, but it's funny.
There's a sense of I hate these people, and therefore I make fun of them. Or I hate what these people believe, and obviously there is a hatred directed and animus directed towards Christianity, particularly when it comes to sexual ethics, which is why the sexual ethic or sexuality of the actors in this scene was so prevalent to their actions and their activities, and to make that to me is where it's like, okay, this is probably stepping over the line from parody or from like a lighthearted kind of exploration of something in a funny way to be something that this is intentionally provocative or trying to be offensive. And then once you say you're offended, then it's like, oh, typical. These Christians get offended by things.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, because the kind of the response was, well, the Simpsons did something like this, and where was all the outrage about that as well? And so, where is that? Where is that line?
There's back to Mel Brooks.
But there's a big difference between when you're watching a TV show, which happens to be a satire, right? And then you're watching an international performance of the Olympic Games, which is meant to be a community event of expression of solidarity as well as, and then to do satire at that, where you're insulting. And here's the thing is, like, I have no problem with good humor as well as even sarcastic humor and satire, but there's a point where I'd say two things. Is like, is it offensive? And I'd say, yes, it's offensive. And was it a mockery? Well, there's one thing when you take a symbol and you invert it. Yeah. Right? And so like you invert the symbol. And that's the whole point, is like, you took the Christian symbol of the Last Supper. For Catholics, obviously, it's where we find the source, the summit, the pinnacle, which is the expression of the Eucharist. It's the deepest dogma of our faith, right? And even if you're not Catholic, it's still, for all Christians across the board, the Last Supper is the pinnacle moment of Jesus' last moments before his going to the crucifixion. So like the scene, and there's a symbol which everyone knows if you just study basic theology, and people who do art history and people who are familiar with the arts, and they know what the symbol means. Right? It's the symbol of communion.
There's no mistake in it.
It's the symbol of communion. It's the symbol of unity. It's the symbol of selflessness. Like the symbolic significance of the Last Supper, regardless of a person believes in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist or not. Right? The significance of that. And then you parallel that as Jan did in 1645 or 35, whatever it was. Yeah. So you invert that. And there's a difference between that's what you were referring to before. You invert the symbol, right? Where now it just becomes a hedonistic feast of debauchery, right? A hedonistic feast of giving in to the passions as opposed to it. And so that's what I'm saying is like, that's where you have not just like a critique of the symbol or even a making fun of it. Now you have a complete inversion. And that's where there's a problem, as well as the fact that and this is the thing that everyone generally speaking across the board, most people don't have a problem when you're making fun of yourself.
Right.
Right? So if Christians were making fun of themselves, or if Muslims are making fun of themselves, or if you have Dave Chappelle who's making fun of him, like that's the reason why, like for instance, take Dave Chappelle, right? Black comedian who oftentimes uses what to other cultures, like if a white comedian was using many of the language that Dave Chappelle would use, like it would be very offensive. But Dave Chappelle, who uses the language because it's directed towards his own community and so forth, like it's not offensive. So in the same way, if Christians were doing a satire or something like that to make points like that, but then you have a group of persons who are not practicing Christians, right? Who oftentimes are, as you're saying, are diametrically opposed to many of the teachings of Christianity, specifically on sexual ethics. You take the Christian, one of the greatest symbols of Christianity, right, the Last Supper, you invert that, and then you invert that from parties who are making a critique of something which they're not a part of,
right?
If that makes sense. That's when it's not just a critique, and that's not even words of the Simpsons, which is, I'd say it's one of the timing, the place is extremely inappropriate. But then, that's what I'm saying. And then you can say, well, it wasn't meant to be offensive. BS. Like BS. No, it was directly.
It's intentional. And that's
it was because you're making a critique of Christians across the board.
As part of your understanding. And I think, again,
what saying you're not inclusive.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Christians are not inclusive.
And so
Christians
they should get their head cut off like Marie Antoinette.
That's right.
Possibly.
That's kind of what it was saying.
That's kind of what it was.
You know, and I think that does, lend more of itself to the offensive nature of it is that it was intentional. I mean, I wish they would have owned it. If they really believed, if they were really doing this as a mockery, it's pretty clear that they were. At least own it. At least say, yeah, we did this. I mean, at least in the Middle East, when one of these countries, take someone out or they attack someone, they'll say, yeah, we did that. At least take, responsibility for it. And so it just come off even worse that they were like, oh yeah, we didn't see that. We're sorry. Maybe it did offend them.
And then they said, you just don't understand. You're basically calling everyone who complains stupid.
Right.
Basically like, you don't understand symbolism, you don't understand narrative, you don't understand how things like this work. And I'm like, no, there's very smart Christians. You can't say that John Bajot, you can't say that Bishop Barron, you can't say that actually the vast majority, actually most people are smart. They might not know the language and things like that, but people generally speaking can understand the symbol and what it means.
Maybe because this was in French and it was by mostly French people, maybe they thought that, well, we're Christian. I mean, we're from France and, we can make fun of ourselves. And you're like, no, it's obvious that the people that were there this was not a, hey, look at us. We're silly, aren't we? It was more than that.
But then that also poses the question also, you say that France is Christian. Like, that's question is France Christian?
That's it. I mean, what does it say about the Christian faith in Europe? And specifically France? I mean, the church's eldest daughter.
Well, France has classically been known that the eldest daughter of the church. I guess the tradition is that the apostles to the apostles, St. Mary Magdalene, did make it all the way out to France, which is an interesting tradition.
Gaul at the time.
So I think about this in terms of the church practice of Christianity, Catholicism in Europe has been on a 3-century decline as far as the rise of secularism after the wars of religion. All the Voltaires and everything else. You have the very specifically anti-religious movements in France in particular, with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars decimating the church. There's actually been incredible surges of renewal. St. James Francis de Chantal, who we've been celebrating, is one of those. But within France itself, within Europe itself, the practice of the faith is in steep decline. And it's one of those sad realities, no matter how strong they were, because you think of the beautiful churches in France, you think of the great saints of France, that now I feel like it's now teenagers kind of basically mocking their parents. Like, oh, isn't this, like, I do feel it's a very, like, this is an example of a very sophomoric critique of like, my dumb parents. They're so dumb. They don't let me have a cell phone. This kind of like
exactly
this sort of juvenile sort of mockery of things.
Well, it's also jumping off that. I think that obviously, yes, participation in the faith seems to be it is on decline throughout vast majorities of Europe, especially in France. It's one of the reasons why Pope Francis has been referencing this. But the other thing which is also on steep decline in Europe is population. So the population is in steep decline. So the average birth rate in Europe is between 1.5 and 1.7 of the native population, which is why a vast majority of people, that they have a lot of immigrants who are coming into Europe right now, especially from Islamic countries. That's why you're finding a huge rise in Islam throughout Europe, which is creating tension with in certain communities, which I also, going back to like when Muslim leaders are stepping up and saying that what happened to the Olympics is also offensive, because there's other parties who see things like this that are happening that are also find it to be troubling. But at the same time, but then the question becomes also for France, like with these changing demographics, like, and also with the rise of secularization and with the rise of a seeming return to kind of pagan roots, right, throughout good chunks of Europe, like, can we really honestly say, like, what's the state of Europe? And because I also think this, we're Catholic in America, right?
Yeah,
we're not too far behind.
Yeah,
as far as secularization,
in terms of secularization
and religion, yeah.
Well, also in terms of decreasing population levels and the need to bring in people from other countries because we don't have enough people.
Yeah, we referenced it not too long ago. It's the first time, and it's a 2-year decline in the birth rate for us since the inception of the United States. So yeah, it's starting to happen to us too. In other words, they're ahead of us, but we're not too far behind.
Correct. But if this keeps trending in the way that it is, and let's say that for a moment that Christians disappear majoritively throughout Europe, right? I'll tell you this, and this is I've heard lots of different people make the same comments online as well. Is like if Christians, we're not going to go out and kill.
Yeah.
At least there might be a few crazy ones out there who are not following the gospel. The Christians, for the most part, and that's where people are like, why are Christians being so sensitive? Like you should just suck it up and take it up. Like no, we're not going. I'm not going to. I don't think most people. That's why everyone's kind of complaining. I think that the Olympic Committee got flooded with an outpouring of messages. But two, like if Christians disappear throughout the world, right, majoritively, and we go into becoming much less, the question becomes, what happens in what there's a void. Right? Yeah. And like what happens, because if you did this, if you mocked or you did some type of satire and you had people who were non-religious pluralists who were doing a satire of Muhammad and the ascension of the Dome of the Rock or something, or a
political system like communism.
You're going to find a very different response from people who are mocking the Quran or mocking Muhammad or mocking Hinduism or mocking various different other ones, which I was going to say you're going to find a very different dynamic than what's going to happen if Christians decrease and disappear throughout the Western world.
So it leads to that question. I realize it's a judgment call, but can we claim that Europe is Christian?
I think it's as the great Flannery O'Connor would refer to the South. It's Christ haunted. It's Christianity haunted, as in like the ghost is still there and still present and still kind of against the backdrop of that. But as far as like actually animating the decisions and the lives of people in a living way, it's probably down to individuals. So I think Christendom, we've talked about that before, has passed away as far as like a culture that's animated by the values of Christianity. You're judged by those. You seek to kind of reconcile yourself with that, even if you're not personally or privately, a believer. That's gone, and I think that's been gone for a long time. And I think we're just sort of in the death throes of that. But now it's just sort of like this sort of weird moral punching bag of like, oh, remember the old days. Like I think about when they moved to legalize abortion in Ireland, which God have mercy on us, they did. Liam Neeson, the famous actor, voiced a commercial that played during that, and it was basically like a shadow is laying over Ireland for too long, and it's basically like shadowy black and white graveyards and stuff, basically about like not having access to abortion, and talking about the shadow of the church, really, which is the last moral bastion there. And even though the church has lost credibility because of abuse stuff, people have stopped practicing their faith. They're still, Catholic haunted in Ireland, much in maybe a different way than France. But the thing we need to throw off is these last moral tendrils of Christianity, which would be like a stance against abortion or a stance in favor of marriage as a lifelong union between one man and one woman, or like whatever else might be, to seek to throw those things off. So I think it's in its death throes, if nothing else. Jesus is alive. Jesus is active. There's great things happening in Europe. there's revival movements. There's lay movements in the church. There's religious orders that are on fire.
They had an uptake on baptism.
People coming into the church
in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And France particularly.
But I think as far as worldly power and secular influence, it's gone. So
yeah, I would agree. The culture, I mean, culturally speaking, it has the trappings of it, but it's culturally speaking. I don't think you can say that Christian, unless there's some type of miracle or revival, I don't think so. I think you can say culturally speaking, it's becoming, it's secular. Like it's secular, it's you're finding rebirth of neo-paganism, like new paganism.
Something's going to fill the void, as you said.
Something's going to fill the void.
You're not going to like it.
Or you're going to find Islam, and that's the thing is, there's been imams and various different Muslims who basically say we don't need to kill the people of Europe. We're just going to breed them out. Because the population isn't just not there.
No.
And so like when you have a major population shifts and things like that, you have major cultural shifts. So
which is a lot smarter of a takeover is to come in and just have more babies. I mean, it's very smart.
But God blesses those who follow the commandment given to Adam and Eve, which is be fruitful and multiply. Yeah. So I'm just saying, like when you have that. I mean, it's the similar dynamic of what's gone on in Israel right now. Like Israel was, traditionally speaking, it was a secular state.
Yeah.
But Israel's birth rate is that the Orthodox are having many more children than the secular Jews. And now over a period of 2 generations, like you have now a major shift, that in that case more towards a conservative Orthodox. But you're now finding in Europe, you're finding the same thing. It's like, who's having children in Europe? And as the persons who are having children in Europe, that's going to shift culture. And that has shifted culture.
Yep.
And that's the thing is like people build culture, families build culture, families who agree on common values shift and move culture. And that's the thing is in Europe, like the culture of Europe, like we'll still have the churches and things like that, but but you're going to find that the culture, I think that you can argue that the vast majority of Europe is Christian anymore. It's secular, but it's going to be replaced by something else.
Yeah. Well, and with all this happening with this slow dying, seems like it's speeding up at times. With the slow dying, I mean, are Christians being overly sensitive then about stuff like this, about satire like this with the Olympics? Are we being overly sensitive? Should we be more understanding of our place and our role?
Yeah, I think we should. It's weird to me to take it personal if you're not taking personal the fact that Christians are walking away from the faith.
Yeah,
that to me is like a greater scandal. Is that obviously the body of Christ, the Eucharist, we honor and adore that. But if you're not honoring and adoring the Eucharist by going to Mass, if you're not honoring and adoring the presence of God and your brother and sister who are baptized, or if you yourself are baptized and not honoring God by turning from sin and living life of holiness, then it's kind of hard to take seriously. I'm scandalized by this, that. But what I think it kind of says is it's all we have left is outrage as a culture because we've been decimated from a moral compass. So all that's left is outrage. So that, this is a flash in the pan kind of outrage at the blasphemy going on against Christianity in formerly Christian countries, and then it's gone. And then you're on to the next thing, and then you're on to the whatever the news cycle is. But moral integrity and transformation is harder and takes work, and says like how like in Pope Benedict of happy memory did a lot of great work in this as far as like what does it mean to be European. What is Europe as an institution? And can you have Europe without Christianity? And he would say no. But once you excise Christianity from that, Europe ceases to exist as a reality, which is exactly what the European Union and other groups have tried to do. And Pope Benedict was one of the few voices on the international stage kind of standing against that. So anyway, I just feel like it's probably people are being too sensitive in some places, but I think in a sense we need to be more intentional, not about being offended and my feathers are ruffled, but saying, what if we even more intentionally proclaim the gospel in the public square, share the truth about the human person, share the truth about who Jesus Christ is, that we're sinners in need of a Savior, and that God has sent His Son, and we can feast on His flesh and blood, given His gift for us in the Holy Eucharist. We're coming to full communion with the church. We turn away from our sins. All those things that are the basics of the gospel message, and live it ourselves. Then I think we have our complaints have a lot more validity and weight.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're being overly sensitive. It's blasphemy. Anyone who believes in their word, anything which is purely blasphemy, right, is so no. Now, on the other hand, I'm not going to kill anyone.
Right. Yes.
Like I'm not going to spew hate, and I'm also going to say it's blasphemy.
Yeah.
It's disrespectful. It's you wouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do this to any world religion, just as a basic point of respect. If you're going to have people making fun of things, it needs to be their own people making fun of their own stuff. Like, you don't need to be pointing out. And I just say the hypocrisy of it is. But on the other hand,
what should we do about this? I mean, what should be the response?
And I was just thinking that in terms of that, I'm not going to kill anybody, which is true. We're not.
Thankfully.
Like the people that were in that play or the people that directed it, I want them to be the greatest saints in the history of the world. I want their hearts to be transformed. I think of the great Saint Genesius, who's a patron saint of actors and comedians. He actually converted in the Roman Empire. He was doing a play. That was mocking Christianity, and he was mocking baptism specifically.
Yeah.
He had a conversion. He met the Lord during that.
Yeah.
His life was transformed. He became a martyr for the faith. So I think about that. I want these men and women, the people that are up there on that stage, I want their hearts, them to know the Lord's love. I want them to be transformed. I want them to be great saints, to turn from all sin, as all of us are called to turn from sin, and to use their gifts for the building up the kingdom of God. So anyway, that's what we should be praying for. Praying for not like death to my enemies. Right. Lord, let my enemies be holier than I. Let them be so transformed by your love that they become saints. And that's a great way to pray for this.
Yeah. And bomb the Olympic Committee. Bomb them in terms of flood.
Love bomb.
Flood their emails. Flood the email box with as much things saying that this is disrespectful, this is wrong, and speak out. And that's the whole thing. Don't allow our voice, our Christian voice, and the world desperately needs our Christian voice. That we don't need physical bombs, but we do need the voice of Christianity to speak out and say no, and also to speak out and say that this is not appropriate. This is not respectful. Yeah. This is unacceptable. This is unacceptable in all regards. And so to use the power of speech and the power of the word, which is Jesus, to say and to call things in truth what they are.
Yeah.
And so I say, but to do that in love. And that's the thing, is to stand against things that are wrong, but you can do that in love. You don't have to do that in hate.
Yeah.
And I would say, too, because this revolves around the Last Supper and the Eucharist, for all those who are Catholic, if you're not Catholic, too, I invite you to go to Mass and go to adoration. Pray, and the way of praying in reparation for the sins of humanity is powerful. Yeah. Praying on behalf of others. Jesus is the one who's a great intercessor on our behalf. And we get to stand in Christ Jesus on behalf of others and pray with and for them. So there's something powerful about that too, praying for good and holy liturgies and for the way that we worship God, the way that we worship the Eucharist. Because when you do that, that changes us too. So I can be mad and outraged at evil behavior and stay. I can stay evil because even if I'm mad about things I should be mad about. But if I'm praying for that and praying with that, then my outrage becomes something better. It becomes a working for justice and for truth in the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us for this conversation on Catholic in America. Never forget, America's number one.
That's right.
And we'll see you next time.